Well, folks, let me tell you something. On October 1st, 2025, in the heart of New York City, the marble halls of the United Nations shook with words sharper than any sword. A young president from a small landlocked nation set the world and the media buzzing with a question: is Africa silent no more? What would happen? Like David daring to challenge Goliath, a new voice from the African continent was rising, defiant, powerful, and unlike anything heard before. Live television cameras ran a shocking headline: Africa declares its right to speak. At the center of it all was Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, who had put the world on trial, not with a war or an economic shock, but with the defiant power of a fierce declaration. Many in the hall were shaken, and international observers had to take note. For the first time in decades, Africa was writing its own story, echoing Thomas Sankara, the leader who had dared to speak similar words before being silenced forever. But here, that old defiance was reborn in the voice of a soldier president. And the question is ours: is this the spark of a new chapter for Africa, or a moment of destiny that will be crushed by the weight of power and death? Do you dare to stand with him? Think about it. The UN Assembly Hall that morning was a cathedral of power. The flags of every nation hung in solemn silence. Delegates whispered in anticipation, and the world's cameras were all pointed at a long wooden podium. This was supposed to be a routine debate on debt restructuring. In reality, everyone in the room knew the agenda had one word written across it: Africa. Sitting near the front was Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso. His presence alone was enough to cause a stir. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit, but a simple military jacket, a reminder that he had risen not through luxury, but through the battlefield. As the chairman introduced the session, Traoré slowly rose to his feet. His movements were deliberate, his gaze steady. He unfolded a piece of paper, but before glancing at it, he looked directly at the officials from the International Monetary Fund. And then he spoke words that would echo far beyond that room. All of Africa owes you nothing. It is you who owe us the truth. A gasp went through the room. For decades, African leaders had voiced their grievances in careful language, appealing for aid and negotiating for relief. But here was a leader who refused to beg. Instead, he accused. He spoke, and what followed was not a speech, but an indictment. He called them the 7 sins of the IMF in West Africa. First, he spoke of the endless debt traps in Ghana and Ivory Coast. He reminded everyone that Ghana was still buried under a $3 billion bailout from 2022, with its debt obligations to the IMF now totaling over $2.7 billion in special drawing rights. Instead of investing in its people, Ghana was sending interest payments abroad. He said the Ivory Coast was shouldering massive debts, mortgaging its future to international creditors. Second, he condemned the forced privatization of Ghana's most precious asset, the cocoa industry. Once the pride of its farmers and the backbone of its economy, it had been handed over to foreign corporations. He said farmers were left with pennies while the profits flowed overseas. Third, his voice grew sharper as he described the brutal cuts to social services in Mali and Senegal. IMF conditions demanded slashed budgets for health and education. The results were plain to see. Children in Mali went hungry while hospitals in Senegal crumbled from lack of funding. Fourth, he turned to Nigeria, recalling the devastating devaluation of the naira in 1986. That collapse, mandated by the IMF, destroyed the middle class almost overnight. The price of imports skyrocketed, inflation devoured wages, and millions fell into poverty. Fifth, he spoke of Liberia and Sierra Leone, where IMF loans continued to flow despite governments riddled with corruption. The people never saw the benefit. They inherited mountains of debt with no progress in development. Sixth, he pointed to his own homeland, Burkina Faso. Under IMF guidance, the nation was encouraged to export raw gold instead of building local industries. The result was predictable. Profits flowed to multinational companies while the people remained poor, watching their land be stripped of its wealth. Seventh, he finished with Niger, where IMF conditions forced the opening of the electricity and telecommunication sectors to foreign investors. In the process, Niger lost control of its most strategic sectors. Independence was traded for survival. With each charge, the tension grew. Delegates shifted in their seats. The IMF officials stared at their papers, avoiding his gaze. Then came the deepest words of all. This is not about money. This is about honor, about Africa's dignity. For a moment, a silence hung in the air like a thundercloud. Then, as if on cue, applause erupted from the African delegations. The applause echoed through the room. The IMF side, however, remained silent, their silence louder than any rebuttal. In that moment, a soldier president from one of the poorest nations on earth had silenced its most powerful financial institution. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled furiously, and millions watching live around the world felt a strange shock. Was this the beginning of something bigger? The scene ended not with resolution but with uncertainty. Traoré had spoken like David challenging Goliath, but history is full of Davids who did not survive the fight. And the question hung in the air, unanswered, almost unbearable. Was this courage, or was it suicide? The applause did not stop. It came in waves, as if the very walls of the UN were echoing one man's defiance. Delegates from Mali, Niger, and Guinea rose to their feet, applauding. Some smiled, some nodded in silent agreement, but all of them understood the weight of what had just been said. On the other side of the hall, the officials sat in silence. Their hands did not move. Their silence was deafening. The real storm, however, was not inside that room. It was outside. Within minutes, the news of Traoré's speech had spread across Africa. Television screens flickered, car radios buzzed, and phones rang across Ouagadougou. In a cafe in Ghana, where cocoa farmers gathered for tea, one man raised his fist when he heard the words, "We owe you nothing." In a village in Mali, mothers gathered their children around an old radio, their eyes filling with tears as someone finally spoke their truth. Commentators on African television stations compared Traoré's defiance to a ghost from the past. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of the 1980s. Sankara had once declared a bold vision for African self-sufficiency, and he had paid for that declaration with his life. Nearly 40 years later, another young president from the same country was standing up with that same spirit. Many whispered, "History doesn't repeat itself. It continues." In Accra, a journalist reminded viewers that Ghana still owed the IMF over 2.7 billion SDR and was carrying one of the largest debt burdens in Africa. In Lagos, scholars called into radio shows saying, "He speaks for all of us." In Ouagadougou, murals of Traoré painted by young artists began appearing overnight next to the face of Sankara. Two soldiers bound together across generations. But even as joy filled the streets, there was fear. Analysts warned that the IMF could retaliate by cutting off aid or tightening credit. International investors might demand higher interest rates, making loans more expensive. Aid agencies quietly warned that food programs could be scaled back. The defiance was thrilling, but the price could be hunger. Still, the energy of the moment was unstoppable. People repeated his words not just as a quote, but as a vow. "This is about dignity, not money." Mothers whispered it to their children. Teachers wrote it on blackboards, and soldiers at checkpoints muttered it like a prayer. For the first time in decades, ordinary people felt represented, and their unity was stronger than their fear. Back inside the assembly hall, a detail had gone almost unnoticed. While the applause was ringing out, a delegate from Niger leaned over to his counterpart from Mali and whispered about issuing a joint statement with Burkina Faso. Within hours, the news was spreading through the corridors. Africa might be about to demand new terms with the IMF. What had started as one man's speech was growing into a strategy. And then, as the room began to quiet down, the silence from the IMF remained. They shuffled their papers, avoided eye contact, and offered no reply. To many, that silence felt like an admission, a sign that the powerful institution had no answer. Now imagine you are sitting in that hall, watching a lone president point his finger at the IMF and accuse them of crimes. Applause is breaking out all around you, but the guardians of global finance sit in silence. What do? Do you applaud, or do you stay silent, afraid of what might come next? In the hours that followed, the euphoria spread like wildfire. News channels across Africa replayed the clip of Ibrahim Traoré standing tall, his finger pointed at the IMF. Commentators called it a turning point, a breaking of the long silence of dependency. In Bamako, Niamey, and Conakry, diplomats began to whisper about unity. Within a day, delegates from Mali, Niger, and Guinea had contacted Burkina Faso's team and proposed a bold idea, a joint African strategy to confront the IMF together. What began as a lone act of defiance was turning into a collective front. In the streets of Ouagadougou, people poured out not in protest, but in celebration. Drums beat, flags waved, and children painted slogans on walls. Africa owes nothing. That night, young artists worked by candlelight to paint murals of Traoré's face next to Thomas Sankara, two soldier presidents separated by 4 decades but united by the same defiance. The city was filled with a sense of victory, fragile but intoxicating. Even outside Burkina Faso, the fire was catching. At the University of Ghana, students wrote online essays calling for their government to reconsider its $3 billion IMF bailout. In Lagos, small groups of activists held rallies with banners demanding independence from foreign rule. On social media, hashtags calling for dignity trended from Dakar to Johannesburg. But with the light came the shadows. In the financial markets of London and New York, investors were watching nervously. Some banks hinted at raising interest rates on African loans. Aid groups quietly warned that food programs might shrink if donors became hostile. Analysts pointed to the brutal arithmetic. According to IMF data, the average debt-to-GDP ratio in sub-Saharan Africa had climbed to over 60%. If credit were cut off, millions could suffer overnight. In Burkina Faso, the government was bracing itself. Advisors debated how to secure grain imports if subsidies were cut. Ministers worried about rising fuel prices, a falling currency, and the possibility of sanctions. Some urged caution, even a retreat. Traoré himself, however, remained unmoved. In a televised address a few days later, he told his people, "This fight is bigger than numbers on a balance sheet. It is about dignity, and dignity cannot be measured in dollars or special drawing rights." For ordinary people, that clarity mattered. Women in the markets of Ouagadougou said they would endure hardship if it meant independence from foreign control. Teachers, who often went months without pay, declared that hope gave their sacrifice meaning. Soldiers at dusty checkpoints repeated the president's words like a mantra. A sense of common purpose was taking root, fragile but undeniable. The paradox was impossible to ignore. The more real the danger, the stronger the solidarity grew. The IMF might punish, the markets might squeeze. But for now, the people of West Africa were unbowed. Still, the inescapable question remained, can dignity survive when the bill for hunger comes due? In Burkina Faso, the echo of Traoré's words did not fade. They wove their way into classrooms, markets, churches, and army barracks. Teachers, tired of empty paychecks, scrawled his line on chalkboards. This is about dignity, not money. Mothers repeated it as a bedtime story, whispering it into their children's ears as if it were a blessing. Soldiers at roadside checkpoints, their rifles slung over dusty backs, greeted travelers not with suspicion but with pride, murmuring, "We owe nothing." The wave spread across West Africa to Ghana, where the memory of IMF bailouts was bitter. Students filled lecture halls to debate alternatives. Young economists posted essays online demanding an end to endless borrowing. Some cited the cold numbers. Ghana's debt had soared to over 90% of GDP in 2022, leaving the country shackled to its repayments. Others invoked the emotion, "Our cocoa feeds the world, but we remain poor." The words of a neighboring president had given shape to their frustration. In Lagos, civil society groups organized small rallies with banners painted in bold strokes. Africa owes nothing. Though the gatherings were modest, the symbolism was powerful. Across the continent, whispers turned into conversations, and conversations turned into possibilities. But perhaps the most unexpected resonance came from thousands of miles across the Atlantic. In the United States, the African American community was listening. At Howard University in Washington, professors gathered their students to review the speech. They analyzed Traoré's speech alongside the words of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and even Frederick Douglass. In pulpits in Harlem, pastors invoked his defiance as a spiritual stand against oppression, connecting the dignity of Africa to the long fight for justice in America. In Atlanta, choirs sang of freedom, weaving Traoré's words into their hymns. On talk radio shows, callers debated fiercely. Some asked if the United States had used the IMF as a tool of influence for too long. Others worried that cutting ties with global finance would leave Africa more vulnerable. The admiration, however, was undeniable. For many African Americans, it was the first time in years that a leader from the continent had commanded international press not as a victim of crisis, but as a voice of defiance. The African American community embraced the wave. Young entrepreneurs in New York and Los Angeles posted messages of solidarity online. Community groups held Q&A forums on how Africans abroad could support movements for financial independence back home. Scholars described the speech as a shattering of the silence of dependency. For once, Africa was not seen as pleading, but as demanding. It was more than just an ovation, it was a shift in perception. A young leader from a small, landlocked nation had awakened pride across a continent and stirred solidarity in faraway lands. In classrooms and in churches, the message was clear. African dignity was no longer negotiable, but pride alone cannot rewrite contracts, nor can applause erase debt. Behind closed doors, leaders in Washington, Paris, and Brussels were watching closely. Their silence was now strategic. They were weighing how to respond not just to Burkina Faso, but to a movement that could soon spread across Africa. The question hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. When the powers finally speak, will they extinguish this spark, or will they fan it into a flame? In Washington, the official response came quickly, though it was carefully worded. The State Department called President Traoré's remarks reckless and warned they could destabilize the fragile Sahel region. Officials reminded reporters that Burkina Faso remained heavily dependent on foreign aid and that antagonizing international institutions would only worsen its struggles. Behind closed doors, however, the mood was more intense. Policymakers acknowledged what few would say publicly. For decades, the United States had relied on the IMF and the World Bank as instruments of influence. To see a young African president challenge them on the world stage was unsettling, even threatening. Some feared it could empower others, triggering a wave of resistance across the continent. Outside of government circles, however, the reaction was different. African-American students, intellectuals, and pastors celebrated Traoré's courage. At Cornell, African studies professors compared his words to the Boston Tea Party, a rebellion not against taxation, but against financial enslavement. At Howard, young scholars debated whether this was Africa's 21st century Declaration of Independence. In churches across Atlanta and Harlem, pastors repeated his line, "This is about dignity, not money." It rang like scripture. The American media reflected this divide. Major outlets like the Washington Post warned of financial isolation and painted Traoré's challenge as a gamble. But smaller publications, independent commentators, and radio hosts celebrated him for his historic defiance. Callers posed a profound question. If Africa owes nothing, then who owes Africa? Across the Atlantic, Europe reacted with unease. In Paris, commentators called the speech radical nationalism, warning it could fracture financial relationships built over decades. In Brussels, officials called for stability and cooperation, but their words carried an undercurrent of fear. For them, the order was more than just an institution, it was a pillar of the global order. To see it questioned so publicly was alarming, even humiliating. Meanwhile, Moscow and Beijing seized the moment. Russian media praised Traoré as the revolutionary heir to the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century. Chinese state media contrasted their no-strings-attached infrastructure loans with the IMF's austerity, suggesting Africa's future lay with new partners. It is important to note, as some analysts cautioned, that not every detail of debt figures and negotiations could be independently verified. Reports spread quickly, sometimes before confirmation, but the overall truth was undeniable. The world was witnessing a divide, and the young president had opened a debate that could no longer be ignored. And so the question is passed to us. If your ancestors could hear these words today, what would they say? The days after Traoré's speech felt less like an aftermath and more like the opening act of something bigger. In Addis Ababa, during a special session of the African Union, several heads of state quoted his words on dignity and honor. They debated not whether to challenge the IMF, but how. Proposals for an African sovereign fund, a shared resource designed to replace dependency on foreign loans, were floated. For the first time in decades, unity had a concrete financial vision. In the streets, the momentum was even stronger. In Dakar, students marched with banners declaring Africa owes nothing. In Lagos, civil society groups demanded their leaders review old IMF agreements. In Ouagadougou, the murals of Traoré multiplied, his image painted alongside Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah, as if he were already being enshrined in the temple of Africa's defiant sons. Musicians composed protest songs, weaving his words into choruses sung in markets and bars. School children memorized his lines as if they were proverbs. The cultural shift was unmistakable. Africa was no longer asking for permission. It was demanding a voice. But the risks were growing just as quickly. International investors whispered about raising the cost of borrowing for African nations. Aid groups warned that food programs could be scaled back. IMF officials quietly issued warnings that countries refusing to comply could lose access to emergency funding, and across fragile economies already ravaged by drought and inflation, such penalties could mean hunger and desperation. Burkina Faso's ministers debated urgently. Some urged Traoré to soften his tone, fearing economic isolation. Others pushed for stronger partnerships with Russia, China, or the BRICS bloc. Traoré himself, in a televised address, seemed undeterred. "This fight is bigger than us," he told the nation. "We do not ask for permission to be free, and we rise up to claim it." Hope and fear now walked hand in hand. For ordinary people, the meaning was simple. They were willing to endure hardship if it meant independence. One woman selling goods in Ouagadougou told a reporter, "We have been poor for decades. If poverty is the price of freedom, we will pay it." Analysts in Washington and Paris watched with anxiety. Some privately admitted that the IMF's credibility had been shaken. What frightened them was not just Burkina Faso, but the possibility that other nations would follow. Paris feared that its centuries-long financial influence in West Africa could shatter. Meanwhile, Moscow and Beijing saw an opening. Russian diplomats offered to host a summit on debt alternatives for Africa. Chinese officials hinted at extending credit lines through their own development banks. The global scales were tipping, and so the future remained unwritten. Would Traoré's defiance spark a continental revolution, uniting nations in a new financial order? Or would the IMF and its allies tighten their grip, pushing millions into crisis? One truth was undeniable. A young soldier president had forced the world to listen. Whether that led to freedom or famine, one thing was clear: Africa had found its voice. And now the question is for you. Would you endure hunger if it brought dignity for generations to come? The image remains etched in memory. A young soldier president standing tall in the marble halls of the United Nations, pointing his finger at the guardians of global finance. His words cracking through the silence like thunder. "Africa owes you nothing." The applause that rang out from that hall rippled through the streets of Ouagadougou and into the hearts of millions far beyond Africa. It was never just about debt, it was about dignity. The thing that no ledger can measure and no contract can erase. For decades, Africa's voice had been muffled under the weight of interest payments and austerity demands. But on that October day in New York, the silence was broken. It was not a plea. It was a declaration. And yet, the struggle ahead is real. Poverty will not disappear overnight. Food insecurity, fragile economies, and political instability remain heavy burdens. The IMF and its allies may retaliate, and hardship could follow. But something deeper has been born, a belief that the continent's destiny belongs not to others, but to Africans themselves. So the question hangs in the air like a vow. Will this flame grow into a revolution of dignity, or will it be extinguished by fear and hunger? If his words touched your heart, leave the word dignity in the comments. Let the words show that you heard him. And if you want to follow this story as it unfolds, join us, subscribe, and walk with us on this journey toward a future where no nation has to bow to debt. Because as Traoré said that day, we do not ask for permission to be free. We have reason to demand it. God bless Africa.